My name is Leo Alfonso. I work in the International Relations and Partnerships team for the STEM disciplines here at ANU. My colleagues Jay and Tammy are in the call today with us. And well, of course, we're joined by Associate Professor David Burrell. So, all right. So, of course, we're very lucky to have Associate Professor David Burrell with us today. I'm sure most of you have already read his bio, so I'll keep it short with regards to introductions. David is a clinical psychologist and an academic. He leads the psychological trauma research group at ANU. He has a National Health and Medical Research Council early career fellow. He was. And in recent years has been a chief investigator of numerous projects funded by the Australian Research Council and Australian Rotary Health. David's research focuses on depression and anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is on today's topic, the perfect segue for me to thank you, David, for your time today and hand over the floor to you. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Leo. So, I'll just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that, can they?
Yeah.
Yep, good. Okay, and I'll just very quickly arrange my slides a bit. Okay, so today I'll be talking about a relatively new approach, or at least new in the sense of the past 10 or 15 years, a new approach that's being used in understanding psychopathology and mental health. And today, of course, I'll be talking about an area of particular interest to me, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So first of all, in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a mental health disorder that arises following exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So that's how it's actually defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the main kind of Bible, so to speak, of mental health diagnosis. So it follows from an event that is profoundly impactful on the person and their life. And I just want to emphasize that at this point, because of course today we'll be talking about PTSD and trauma. I hope that people will be okay with that, but I do want to emphasize as well that for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, usually what they've experienced has had a very profound effect on them. Most of us, by the time we reach adulthood, we've experienced at least one potentially traumatic event in our lives. The interesting thing about human beings, in a sense, is that the majority of us are quite resilient. So for most of us, when we experience a potentially traumatic event, it's unlikely that we will develop PTSD. Only a minority of people exposed to a given traumatic event go on to develop PTSD. Of course, it depends on the nature of the event. Some events are more likely to proceed to PTSD than others. But nonetheless, human beings in general are very resilient. But one of the most established findings when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder is that there is what we call a dose-response relationship. So what that means is the more cumulative lifetime exposure to potential trauma you've had, the more likely you are to go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are certain work-related roles which are, of course, considerably higher risk for people in terms of developing PTSD, given the roles that some people are performing for their work. A curious thing about PTSD is that it's, in many respects, you could say it's the only psychiatric disorder that we know the cause of, and that is that the person has had exposure to a traumatic event. Without that traumatic event, a person can't have PTSD. So thinking about mental health more generally, there really aren't any psychiatric disorders that we know the cause of, despite decades of biological and genetics research, brain imaging research, psychology-based research. So in terms of prevention, with PTSD, there is a very clear way, of course, of potentially preventing PTSD, and that is reducing people's exposure to trauma as best as we can. That's not always possible, but at least we do have a sense of course, what causes PTSD. So many of you will be familiar with the DSM-5, which, as I said, it's the kind of the main diagnostic manual that's used by psychiatrists and psychologists throughout much of the world. There is also the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases that the World Health Organization put out. But the ICD and DSM are the two main diagnostic manuals that are used throughout the world. And it's fair to say that over the years, there's been a lot of debate and to some extent confusion as to how something like PTSD might best be codified in a diagnostic manual like DSM. So you can see there on the right-hand side, and these aren't all the criteria, you can see there's a lot of separate criteria that a person needs to have to meet a diagnosis of PTSD. And depending on the symptom cluster, they need sometimes 2 symptoms within some clusters, just 1 symptom among other clusters. And so PTSD is really complicated. As you can imagine, there's a whole range of different ways in which PTSD might express itself in a person. And if you're a clinician, if you're a clinical psychologist like myself, and you're working with a client, how that PTSD expresses itself or is evident to you as a psychologist in the room varies greatly. And so diagnosing PTSD is complicated. And funnily enough, some researchers a few years ago did an actual kind of mathematical calculation of all the different iterations you can have of individual symptoms to meet criteria for PTSD. And as you can see, there are actually over 630,000 different ways a person can meet criteria for PTSD, if you consider all the different combinations of symptoms that a person might have. So PTSD is complicated. It's hard to understand in the sense of the varying ways that it expresses itself and the various ways that it affects a person. And not only is PTSD complicated, but of course, it's not the only diagnosis that commonly follows exposure to trauma. We know that depression is almost as common as PTSD as a response to a traumatic life event. It's complicated understanding how a person adjusts to stressful life events. And when we try and understand PTSD and when we think about how it's best understood and best codified in diagnostic manuals, it's complicated because the research that underpins those diagnostic manuals is somewhat inconsistent in its own right. So there are various clusters of symptoms in the DSM. So there are kind of what we call re-experiencing symptoms like nightmares, flashbacks, when a person in a very stressful way experiences reminders of the traumatic event. There are avoidance symptoms. Obviously, people with PTSD like to and would, if they can, avoid reminders of the traumatic event. And there are other symptoms, some of them are to do with arousal and affect and how kind of people can feel very activated and chronically anxious following exposure to a traumatic event, and anxious in a way that just doesn't seem to go away. But the key thing here is that despite lots of studies over many years and many studies using what we call factor analysis approaches, there've just been inconsistent findings regarding what best constitutes PTSD and how we define those symptom clusters. So it's really tricky when we're seeing a client as a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. there are well-established clinical interviews and semi-structured diagnostic interviews and questionnaires that we can use, but definitively recognizing and diagnosing PTSD is complex for the reasons I've mentioned. It expresses itself in so many ways, and so a real distinction, in a sense, between psychiatry and mental health versus, if you like, more mainstream medicine is that many areas of biomedicine have very well established, very sensitive diagnostic tests that can be used to diagnose particular conditions or problems. If I go to my physician, they might recommend that I have a blood test to check my thyroid levels or to test for something else. And for many medical conditions, there are very clear and well-defined thresholds and tests that can be done to find out fairly definitively whether someone has a particular medical condition. With mental health and psychiatric disorders, it's much less clear. We have these established questionnaires and things like that, but it's very multifactorial. There's a lot of things that need to be considered. We need to understand the person's context that they're living in, their social background, as well as potential biological factors and things like that. For me, while that makes mental health and psychiatry in some ways a little bit less clear, it's also what makes it so fascinating to work as a clinical psychologist, to be given the privilege to be in a situation where I can think through and consider all these converging factors that might influence a person's mental state, as we call it, and the presence of a potential disorder. Another interesting thing with respect to mental health and psychiatry is that despite a few decades now of very well conducted and very, very elaborate brain imaging research, we still, not only for PTSD, but for all psychiatric disorders, there is no conclusive way of determining whether a person meets criteria for a particular disorder based on brain imaging research. And there's no genetic tests as yet that definitively identify any psychiatric disorder. So it's really complex. And as I said, we rely a lot on these questionnaires. You may have completed one if you've ever seen a psychologist or a psychiatrist, in these kind of interviews, but there is judgment involved, and clinical judgment forms a large part of it. And so in terms of understanding disorders and the way that these various disorders are defined in manuals like the DSM-5, historically in psychiatry and psychology, there's been a reliance on the idea of latent variables, this idea that you can't actually see a disorder. It's not as though you can hold depression in your hand. It's not something concrete. You can't locate depression, for instance, in any part of the brain in particular with 100% reliability. There aren't particular genes that have been identified yet for things like PTSD or depression. So the idea is, and historically the thinking has been, that depression or a psychiatric disorder is a kind of latent construct, something that cannot be directly observed, but we infer the presence of depression or PTSD based on the expression of particular symptoms, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier. So we're very much relying on our clients or patients to report certain symptoms, to say, look, David, my sleep hasn't been good, or I've been feeling irritable lately, or I've lost interest in activities. And then we apply those diagnostic manuals and then work towards a diagnosis. So the thinking here is that these underlying latent constructs, and you can see there's a diagram there with major depression and the idea that it expresses itself as various symptoms. The idea is that depression, or in the case of PTSD causes the expression of certain symptoms and certain patterns of symptoms. And the idea is that various symptoms are more likely to co-vary, more likely to co-occur because they share this common underlying determinant like depression or PTSD. And that's tricky. It's tricky when we're trying to develop treatments because when we're thinking about treatments and interventions, we're having to assume that treatments, in the case of PTSD, change PTSD, which then becomes evident through changes in symptoms. But of course, that's really tricky because we can't see PTSD itself. We can't observe it. So it's kind of a complication of these latent variable models. The other weakness of some of these latent variable models is that it's assumed that the causes of most mental disorders are just these singular disorder factors, these latent variables like depression or anxiety, when in actual fact, the causes of mental disorders are highly likely to be massively multifactorial. The reason we haven't been able to locate particular pathways in the brain that underpin particular disorders is because not everyone who has a disorder necessarily would have that pathway damaged or disturbed or activated in a particular way. There's a whole range of ways in which a person might develop a particular disorder. There are social factors that contribute, psychological processes, as well as some of those biological processes. Not only that, for a lot of psychopathology and mental health problems, there seem to be a lot of bidirectional relationships. So if you think of social withdrawal and the tendency that we all have to kind of avoid social activities and engagement when we're feeling lousy, well, social withdrawal can lead to low mood, because if I'm not feeling like going out and doing things, I'm not likely to feel particularly happy. But then low mood can in turn lead to more social withdrawal. I don't then feel like going out if my mood is low. So just going back a slide, you can see here all these arrows are in one direction. The assumption is that the underlying latent disorder expresses itself in all these symptoms, but it must often be bidirectional. And if you think about it, there's a bit of an asymmetry in a sense. If we take a medical example for a moment and think about brain tumors, well, brain tumors often cause headaches, but headaches don't often cause brain tumors. And so when it comes to at least clinical psychology, often what we're left with is we're trying to treat symptoms like avoidance symptoms by encouraging a person to go and do things they've been avoiding. But to use that analogy, we wouldn't try and treat a brain tumor by trying to treat the headache, which might be the observable symptom of the underlying brain tumor. So likewise with PTSD, rather than trying to treat hyperarousal symptoms as a symptom, we should ideally be trying to treat whatever PTSD is. And it's interesting when you think about it, because in psychiatry and mental health and clinical psychology, there are no conditions that we can identify in the absence of symptoms. We are very much reliant on symptoms as the guide to the presence of particular disorders. So those latent variable models underpinned our understanding for decades. But in the past 10 to 15 years, there has been an emergence of network models of psychopathology. And so these take a very different approach. These models assume that mental disorders don't necessarily arise from some unobservable latent variable that underpins these symptoms and drives the symptoms. Instead, the argument here is that mental disorders arise from complex causal interactions among symptoms. So you can see on the right-hand side here, there's a whole bunch of symptoms. And the idea is that a mental health disorder emerges as a product of those complex patterns of causal interactions among symptoms. So no underlying pathology, if you like, is proposed here. It's actually the interactions among the symptoms themselves that are thought to be sufficient for explaining the emergence of psychopathology or a mental health problem. So there's no assumption here that disorders arise from a single cause. Instead, it's the interaction among all these symptoms. So disorders exist as systems of symptoms, not necessarily as entities in and of themselves. It's not as though there's this unitary thing called depression. On the other hand, depression is a kind of complex system that is a product of the interactions of all these different symptoms. So just to pause for a moment in terms of some of the terminology that's used in this area, we talk about nodes and edges. So nodes are, in this context, the symptoms, and the edges are the kind of lines that connect the symptoms. So, and these kind of nodes are connected by kind of partial correlation coefficients in most instances. So if you know about correlation, obviously it's an association between the various variables here. And you can see how you can actually calculate how, in a sense, activation of one symptom might lead to activation of another symptom, depending on how strong that edge, that line is that connects the symptoms. In some of the diagrams, you'll see, I'll just go back a slide, the thicker the line, that suggests a stronger connection, a stronger association between symptoms. The thinner the line, a less strong relationship. Some of you may be familiar with social networks and things like that. Network theory underpins a lot of areas of science these days. Obviously, social networks, often the thinking is that the nodes are actually individuals rather than, in this case, symptoms. But in the world of kind of mental health research, we're usually thinking of the nodes as being symptoms of a given disorder. So these network models of psychopathology allow for complexity, and they accommodate the complexity, as we've just seen with PTSD. One of the ways they accommodate complexity is that they allow for the fact that external factors might activate certain symptom systems and networks. So you can see, looking at this diagram here, phase one is a kind of healthy individual who isn't exposed to stress at that given time. And you can see E1, the circle at the bottom there, that's maybe if we think of it as an external stressor. At phase two, that external stressor happens. Let's just say a person loses their job. And you can see that S1 and S2 there become activated by that. You know, maybe the person starts to lose sleep because they're stressed about not working. Maybe their mood goes down. You can see at phase three that according to the network and the strength of connections in the network, what happens is that the symptoms can then spread from one to another. And then by phase four, you can actually have a disorder that has a life of its own, if you like. So the person may have actually found a job, but the disorder, let's just say in this case, depression, may continue. It kind of becomes self-perpetuating. So that's what we call hysteresis in terms of symptoms that continue to activate each other even after the stressor has passed. So network models allow us to consider things like that. These network approaches also allow us to understand things in different ways. So the idea of mental health would be a stable state of a weakly connected network, you know, that isn't changing much, that isn't particularly vulnerable to external stressors. It doesn't imply the absence of symptoms entirely. You know, many of us will have some symptoms of depression if we're having a hard day, but it's not necessarily at the level or threshold of a disorder. But nonetheless, mental health would imply that our symptoms and our system of symptoms are relatively stable and not particularly activated. Mental disorder, on the other hand, would be a stable state of a strongly connected network. So that's where, as I said earlier, you know, that's where that system has kind of become self-perpetuating. The idea of resilience is that there might be a particular network in a sense that a person might have, but it might be so weakly connected that when something happens in the person's life, it might not lead to much spreading of activation through that symptom network for the person. So they may be relatively resilient. It doesn't tip over into a disorder, so to speak. And a person might be considered vulnerable if there's a strongly connected network that would easily be tipped over into a disorder. Maybe, for instance, if a person's not sleeping well, if they're somewhat socially isolated, things like that, they may be quite vulnerable to developing a disorder if some of those symptoms become activated and easily activate other symptoms. So, of course, things are really, really complicated. This is just, I won't go into detail here, but this is just kind of one schematic expression of maybe how depression might kind of manifest for people. You can see it also allows for a kind of time progression across time as well, in terms of how different symptoms and processes might interact with each other. Okay, so these network models of psychopathology allow us to answer really interesting questions. So one of the questions is potentially just to understand these disorders in the first place, in terms of, well, how closely and strongly associated are particular symptoms, which symptoms are part of a particular network of psychopathology. But we can also start to think about the symptoms that might bridge between different clusters and different networks. So when it comes to being a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, what we're often interested in is a kind of comorbidity or co-occurrence of disorders. A lot of people who go for help to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist will have multiple disorders. A person might have depression and PTSD. And so it's important to know whether there are particular symptoms or processes which might be bridging between the two, which might be meaning that their PTSD is also contributing to their depression, for instance. So with network models, we can start to understand what some of these bridge symptoms might be. And we can also understand how stable or easily disrupted these networks are by examining the networks across time to see how they change and how easily disrupted they might be by treatment or changes for the person. So I'll just today mention a very preliminary study that we've conducted with 385 American adults who all endorsed at least one exposure to a potentially traumatic event in their lifetime. So they'd all had exposure to a traumatic event. Some of them may have had PTSD, others may not have, but they all were at risk of developing PTSD by virtue of having had exposure to a traumatic event. And so we recruited this participant online. It was part of a larger prospective study. You can see some of the demographics of the sample there. And the first question we were interested in was to do with the stability of PTSD symptoms. So this gets a little bit technical, so I won't go into great detail here, but we conducted a network analysis to examine how much symptoms changed across a 2-month period. And you can see in the upper right corner there, for this analysis, we didn't use all the full 20 symptoms of the DSM diagnosis of PTSD. Instead, these are the symptoms of the ICD-11 diagnosis of PTSD. So there's just 6 or so of these. And these are kind of the two network models that emerged from the data. There's the one on the right kind of needs to be mentally rotated, if you like, in your mind's eye. But you can see if you do that they're very similar. You can see that 3 and 4, avoidance symptoms, avoidance of internal and external reminders are very closely connected, as you could imagine. And that pretty much all the other symptoms are related to each other, but there are some differences as well. So the interesting thing here, we ran the network analysis in terms of the strength of connections between particular symptoms. There's obviously a lot of graphs on this screen, but if you look at the expected influence graph, the item that had the greatest expected influence at baseline was the being super alert or watchful. So on the x-axis there, that's a Z score, a standardized score. But that had changed a little bit by 2 months. At 2 months, the most strongly kind of connected symptom was an avoidance symptom, avoiding internal reminders of the experience. So there were some changes to the network across those 2 months. But when we analysed it statistically, there were no statistically significant differences, at least in this smallish sample for this sort of analysis. So broadly speaking, these networks weren't significantly different across 2 months. In other words, PTSD symptoms remained relatively stable and persistent across a 2-month period. This is a very basic analysis with a very smallish data set. There have been other studies that have looked at PTSD symptoms across 12 months. And you can see the small symptoms here because this is using the DSM symptoms in these diagrams. In this other study, it seemed that there were some symptoms to do with arousal and re-experiencing that became increasingly connected with each other across a 12-month period. So there were some changes in that other study. Another interesting question that we can examine with these approaches is, as I mentioned earlier, we can look at what symptoms bridge between different clusters of symptoms, or in this case, different disorder groups. So there are kind of two communities, as we call them, of symptoms here. There's the depression symptoms in green and the ICD-11 PTSD symptoms in blue. And you can see they both form slightly separate but connected networks together. That Goldbricker test that it mentions there, that's just saying that for the avoidance symptoms, we kind of combined them into one because statistically they were kind of redundant. There was a redundancy there. So there's only 5 PTSD symptoms, not 6 in this analysis. But when we looked at the bridge symptoms, the 3 bridge symptoms seemed to be to do with psychomotor agitation and retardation, as we call it. So that's broadly kind of feeling very agitated and restless, as people sometimes do if they're depressed. Or when we talk about retardation, that's a kind of slowing of speech, a slowing of movement. It can be either way that expresses itself in depression. But it seemed that was one of the symptoms that links PTSD and depression. Intrusive memories was another one. Intrusive memories are very central to the experience of PTSD, but they also are common in depression as well. People have these unwanted, upsetting memories of an event that pop into their mind. And another bridge symptom was what we call exaggerated startle response. That's that kind of tendency where, if someone slams a door, that we jump out of our skin, so to speak. And that's a very common symptom in PTSD. And it seemed to be one of the ones that links PTSD to depression. So the idea here would be that if you're a clinician, you might be thinking, okay, well, if I want to be most efficient and effective with my treatment, maybe I should target one of those bridge symptoms, because if I do that effectively, then potentially both depression and PTSD symptoms might start to fall away, rather than just depression or just PTSD symptoms. And another very preliminary analysis we ran here was to look at whether further trauma exposure is associated with differences in the network structure. So we followed people up 6 months later. There was probably a little bit of over-reporting in that a third of the sample reported that they'd experienced some level of further trauma exposure across 6 months. So that's a bit higher than we would otherwise expect. But the idea with this analysis is we're looking like at that E1 in this diagram, we're looking at a potential stressor or traumatic event and whether it leads to a change in the network and the network structure across 6 months. So you can see here on the right-hand side of this slide here, the 2 network diagrams at 6 months. On the one hand, they look different, but they're also quite similar in a sense. Obviously, the avoidance symptoms 3 and 4 are quite closely connected. And in both cases, 5 and 6, these sort of arousal symptoms of being jumpy and easily startled and super alert are kind of closely connected. So the question here is whether these two networks are meaningfully different at the 6-month point. So we can run a test, a network invariance test, as we call it. In this case, it suggested that there weren't significant differences in the network from baseline to 6 months later. So the network invariance test looks at the network overall, its overall structure, and what it suggests. It's what we call an omnibus test. It suggested that there weren't any edges that were significantly different from baseline to 6 months, depending on whether you'd experienced a trauma in that time. The other test that we ran was what we call a global strength test, and it suggested that there was no difference in the overall connectivity between the two networks across 6 months. They were just as tightly connected. So that's really interesting. That suggests that if a person has some level of PTSD symptoms, that they may not necessarily change a lot with 1 or 2 additional stressors within a short time frame. Maybe, as I said earlier, going back to that dose response idea, maybe it takes an accumulation of a lot of traumatic experiences for a person to experience major changes in their symptom network of PTSD. So a few things to keep in mind with these sorts of analyses. One of the limitations is that these analyses are conducted at kind of across participants and across individuals. And we need to be careful with our reasoning, because we need to be careful not to assume that results that apply across individuals also apply within an individual, within a particular person. So just because across people there is a link between, for instance, symptom 2, which is these intrusive images or memories, and symptom 3 being avoidance, just because that applies across individuals, it doesn't necessarily mean that within any one individual you could expect that to hold. So we need to be careful with that. Interestingly, there are potential ways in which these networks spread across individuals, in that one person's symptom may activate another. So if you think of, say, a family unit, a family, irritability in one person may activate interpersonal withdrawal in another, or a child's sleep disturbance may also activate sleep problems for a parent. And so there's some really interesting research being conducted these days on the extent to which these networks and activation of these networks spread from one person to another. And just to make things more complicated, there's really interesting research happening in terms of hierarchies of networks. So there might be networks subsumed within other networks. So an individual's network of symptoms might be subsumed within a group of people and their kind of collective propensity for certain symptoms and things like that. So we're only just at the very earliest stages of trying to understand some of those relationships. Just going back to that point about the importance of not making assumptions about individuals based on group level data. One of the ways in which research is progressing in that respect is that we're increasingly conducting research based on individuals and looking at when we measure things in the one person over many time points, we can then start to map these networks across time and how they change across time. So there's a lot of research happening in that space at the moment. We do need to be careful when we're looking and talking about some of this research in terms of making causal inferences. The theory implies that these symptoms cause each other and interact in a causal way, but the way we do our research doesn't always allow us to form causal inferences. So we try and be careful about that. I won't go into detail. This is quite a technical point, but a number of the methods that we use statistically to analyze this data assume that there is sparsity in the network. That is, that the symptoms aren't closely connected and have few connections with each other. But that's more a limitation of some of the research that's happened today. But we're increasingly addressing that. So anyway, of course, I was talking a lot about PTSD and depression, but I guess what I'm implying here is that much of this logic and much of this network theory of mental disorders can be applied across all sorts of different research areas in the area of psychiatry and mental health. So I'll leave it there for now, and certainly happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for a very insightful and interesting lecture. Yeah, so I'll encourage our attendees to submit any questions they may have. In particular, I've been taking a lot of notes, like if I've been in class myself. Of course, I don't come from a psychology studies background, so a lot of this has been very interesting. And some of the reflections I've been making, we have someone raising the hand. I think the preference will be to type in the questions. However, if you prefer not to type, I'll open the microphone to let the audience ask the question. Let me give you a second to see if you type the question. If not, I'll open. Allow to check. Okay, Astana, I think I'm going to open the microphone to you.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
please go ahead.
unmuting me. The chat is disabled. That's why I was not able to type there.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, this might be a problem for everyone then.
Yes. So thank you for this wonderful talk, David. I am an associate professor in psychology in India. And I do research in anxiety and memory, and I do a lot of interventions in my with my researcher scholars. And in one of your slides, you mentioned that mental health is a stable state of weakly connected network. And that intrigued me. And I was just wondering that if this is the case, and whatever intervention we are trying to adopt, probably those interventions may not be so effective enough to target these weakly connected networks. So are you suggesting that we should go with those methodologies where the neurostimulation or pharmacological method or integration of pharmacology and neurostimulation would be a potential intervention in such regard, so that so that is what I want you to give us an insight, because somewhat like when we talk about CBT and exposure therapy, seems that it is not so robust enough. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, so of course, mental health is kind of, in a sense, the desired end state of any treatment. So, of course, when we're treating someone, that's where we want them to get to. And where we want them to get to is, yes, a weakly connected network. So what we want ideally is that, say, for instance, if someone goes for a few nights of not sleeping well, we want that sleep disruption to only be weakly connected to activating something else like irritability. So what we work towards with treatment is a weakly connected network, and we want it to be a relatively stable state where there's not excessive activation of symptoms very easily on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. So in terms of interventions, what that means, of course, in terms of the network theories of mental health, is that ideally we should be aiming to kind of reduce the strength of those connections between symptoms. So that might mean thinking, okay, well, to use this example of sleep and irritability, it might be thinking, okay, well, if the person is going for a few nights without sleep, how can they ensure that that's not going to lead them to feel too irritable the next day or on a day-to-day basis kind of thing? So looking at interventions which might break that association a little bit. Now, that could be either a biological intervention or a psychological therapy intervention or anything else, but But I guess the thinking would be along those lines. So weakening those edges, those connections, and also, of course, reducing the symptoms that are most central to the network and driving the network. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, I guess it's.
Thanks. Thanks for that. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, back to using the Q&A, please. So there's two different sections, one chat and one Q&A. Please click on the Q&A. You should be able to type your questions there. And I see one just came in. I'm a health informatics student from Vellore Institute from India. Fascinated about this topic. Great information, David. But what will you guide a health informatics student like me to look this as an option in further in my life or at ANU? Okay, so it's a bit asking a bit of guidance in terms of where to, I guess, career or study wise.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a great question, and I think these approaches really demonstrate the kind of multidisciplinary approaches that are being taken these days. So there's a lot of computational modeling of these networks that's done by people, computer scientists, mathematicians, people like that, biostatisticians. And of course, they're working alongside people like myself who are much more kind of psychologists or people like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, especially if you're, for instance, enrolled in a degree program that incorporates, elements across some of those disciplines. So it's increasingly becoming useful, I would suggest, to be a person who, even if you're, for instance, a health practitioner of some sort, it's important that you try to remain up to speed with and abreast the research that's coming more from the science side of things, and vice versa. If you're a scientist, there's a lot happening in the clinical practitioner's world that's important to be on top of.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So while we wait for more questions to come in, I wanted to ask one myself, actually. And I wanted to talk to you or get you to talk to us about the use of network analysis, if I understand this correctly, and how it can be used to perhaps create tailored treatment plans for patients. So if you identify different networks, I guess you can have categories and then say, well, for this type of network, I create this plan or I respond with this plan.
Yeah, that's a great question, because ultimately that's where we want to head. When we talk about personalized medicine, things like that, we're wanting to understand for this given person, this patient in front of us, how, for this person in particular, does the disorder express itself? And not only that, what are the best points of intervention? Because how you intervene would depend on the person's particular constellation of symptoms and how they're interacting. So so of course, ultimately, hopefully in the future, we will be at a point where we can be capturing a lot of data, especially across time for each individual, so that we can be aware not only of what symptoms a person might have, but also how those symptoms change across time and with particular interventions. Because as it stands, as a clinical psychologist, I see a client, I might give them a questionnaire, I have a sense of what their symptoms are now, and maybe at the end of treatment. But these network models, they need a lot of data. But if you have that data, you can start to make those much more granulated hypotheses about what's going to be most effective to try and change or intervene with to help the person.
Great, thanks for that. A question just came in, and one just came in my head as a follow-up to your answer. But let's get to this one first. And can PTSD be considered an evolutionary phenomena, where PTSD is simply a strong aversion that develops as a survival behavior in response to certain extreme experiences, such that only those individuals who encounter these experiences develop such strong psychological symptoms?
Yeah, look, that's a fascinating question. And there are definitely evolutionary theories and models of PTSD. And if you think about it, PTSD is an example of a very healthy mind in a sense. It's a brain that learns very effectively. So if, for instance, I'm in a car accident at a particular set of lights, what I learn from that experience is that maybe driving a car can be dangerous and I might collide with a pole kind of thing. And the symptoms of PTSD are very, very effective at ensuring that I don't put myself back in that same situation. So, of course, one of the main clusters of symptoms for PTSD are avoidance symptoms. I don't want to go back to where the accident happened. I don't want to think about it. Other symptoms, those hyperarousal symptoms, being alert and on guard, that helps me to avoid further car accidents because I'm much more aware of cars and where they are. And intrusive memories, that keeps it active in my mind. I don't forget that I can potentially be in another car accident. So it's a big learning experience kind of thing. So in an evolutionary sense, in some respects, PTSD is kind of an adaptive response. It's our brain telling ourselves, don't put yourself back in that situation again. Now, of course, most traumas are uncontrollable situations. So we don't have perfect control over whether the same trauma happens again. But that's kind of our brain's overdrive, like our brain's protective mechanism is in overdrive in those situations. It's really trying hard to make sure that we don't experience that same life-threatening situation again. I'm not sure if that's answering that question, but yes, it can certainly be understood in evolutionary terms. And just to link that to this network analysis approach of things, or network models, what that means is that the network models, we would have theories about how these models, how these symptom clusters might evolve or change with certain life experiences in an individual. And then across generations of humans, we would expect changes in these networks of PTSD from one generation to the next, if there's an evolutionary process occurring. So yeah, fascinating to think about.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, and no questions have come now, so I'll take the opportunity to then ask my follow-up question to the previous conversation we were having about tailored treatments. So what do you think would be then the challenges into bringing this into practice? Yes, so making it something available for all practitioners.
Yeah, it's a great question. These days, there aren't really many limits in terms of computational challenges. And obviously with AI and things like that, these very elaborate analysis approaches are no longer an obstacle. Where I think there's the greatest obstacle is that when we're wanting to understand the networks of symptoms for a particular individual, we just need lots and lots and lots of measurements across time. And from a statistical perspective, ideally, we need like 100 measurements across time. So it's actually really hard to capture that from a person. Even if we're using a mobile phone app, of course, by the 50th time, they're answering the same questions, they're getting a bit bored. So it's kind of a practical limitation in that sense. But if a client or a patient were willing to do that, then that would be fantastic, because then we've got enough data, enough time points to really model all those symptoms and how they interact.
All right, interesting. So it sounds like part of it's making this information available to patients inclusive, like making people aware that these networks exist and these connections between symptoms exist, and well, they can be treated. Yeah, interesting. All right. So we are not receiving any more questions. We are also almost on time, so we have the option, unless any of my colleagues also present here have any questions they will want to ask. I think we can thank you for your time today. And yes, as always, we know you're a very busy person, and this has been a great hour we have shared. And yes, thank you very much. Also, thanks to the audience, actually. Sorry, I forgot to say that. Thank you for the audience to connect and to interact and ask very interesting questions as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, so with 3 minutes to spare, then I think that's it for today. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.